welcome back to a very special Mozzy Sales episode because we are actually down at the sailing club and I've got a couple of special guests in that they're actually here in person. So welcome to the final episode. Right, well, welcome back to Mozzy Sales. We're actually here in person at what was supposed to be a sunny Hayling Island Sailing Club. Fortunately, the weather's let us down, but we have been released from our bedrooms and offices to bring you the final America's Cup episode from Hayling Island Sailing Club. So, a few things to talk about today. First of all, we didn't really cover it in the last video, and I want to talk about it, and that is INEOS being challenger of record, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the format very briefly before looking at Rossa and Emirates Team New Zealand and just sum up their cup campaigns. So first of all, INEOS challenger of record. Had so many people message me about this. What does it mean? What is the challenger of record? Is it an advantage to be the challenger of record? I've kind of got my views on it. I did a bit of research today. I don't think a challenger of record has ever won the America's Cup. Anyone follow the history of the Cup and got any views on that? And if that's going to change this time with INEOS?
Well, I think sometimes we've seen challengers of record being kind of puppet teams, effectively. So if the defender will arrange with someone who they feel they can comfortably beat, they'll be the challenge record, get the whole thing kicked off, avoid any deed of gift matches kind of thing. And ultimately we saw Lingy trying that after Valencia, the second time in Valencia, and it didn't really work out the way they thought, and it kind of led us down this long path where we've now ended up on the AC75s. If there was any advantage, it was mainly exploited by Rossa the last time round when the AC75 was a new class. So I think now that they are definitely committed for the next Cup, and it looks like they're at least agreeing in principle, whether or not it's enforceable is another matter, but they're agreeing in principle that they're going to stick with the AC75s for at least the next 2 cycles. So most of the advantage you would have got has kind of happened in this cycle, and I think going forward it'll just be little things, and maybe you can have some say in the format of racing.
Yeah, so just to cover off a bit of the backstory to this for people who watch, because it is a bit confusing. So the America's Cup is a challenger and defender competition. Defender stays on, and through history it's been more likely to be a single challenger, and then the yacht club who's defending it has actually often picked from a selection of defending syndicates who was going to represent them. And you know, what happened later on in the 1900s, and you know, basically the IACC classes, and I think the 12 metres as well, we started to see a bit of emergence of like a challenger series, and that's where the term challenger of record comes from. The challenger of record was the person who put the initial challenge in, was there for the record, organised the competition, was there kind of representing the kind of like multiple challengers through the process to get a fair competition. But often it's not really in the interest of the defending club to get a super competitive challenge. And actually Rossa was a bit of an anomaly in that they were a super competitive team. The history behind that was that Rossa actually not funded, but certainly donated resource to Emirates Team New Zealand. I think that they had like a mutual desire to get Oracle out of the Cup, and donated towards Emirates Team New Zealand's campaign, and that's where the relationship came from. But actually Rossa has been for a long time a really one of the dominant America's Cup teams, and we're kind of an anomaly in the fact they're actually quite a competitive challenger, and I think that's why we saw the breakdown in the relationship. So unusual, but it did afford Rossa the ability to be part of the design of a new class. And now, are INEOS getting any of that benefit? I'm not so sure.
That's my feeling. I think INEOS BAR wanted to be challenger of record for this Cup, and Rossa got it ahead of them at that time, and so there may be some benefits, and they might get a bit of a deeper insight into the rules earlier, but it's not going to be a significant change from what we've seen this Cup. And we've seen that the challengers, American Magic and INEOS were at a disadvantage this cycle. I just don't think that that's going to be the case this time round. I think it's a nice status thing. I think it's Jim Radcliffe getting to do what he wants to do and try and push it, and then maybe have a bit more swing about, these rumours about the racing in cows, but I don't see it as being the advantage that Luna Rossa got this time round.
Yeah, it's an awkward situation when you're always walking around the boat park, not really quite in on the decisions, and I think they wanted to eradicate that. I also think for INEOS, Jim Radcliffe, BAR, I think that group, that partnership, are actually quite confident in the kind of wheels they set in motion towards winning the Cup. For them, I think they're in it for the long haul, and the main threat to them winning the Cup, I think, that they see is a lack of continuity, is someone coming in with a deeded gift challenge, is someone changing the rules and having to figure out a new boat. So I think from their point of view, the challenge record, it's valuable in that it just keeps things consistent so they can get a good run for a couple of cycles at it, rather than this advantage in terms of getting ahead in the design in the way that Luna Rossa was potentially able to do as the previous challenge record. I think that's like 90% of the reason that they've gone for that position.
Well, I think the kind of flip side of this coin is that Luna Rossa have effectively blown their chance now. They really played the long game. So Luna Rossa only entered the Cup in San Francisco to support the Kiwis. They publicly stated it was the only reason they were really there. They had no intention of making it through to the final. They withdrew when it was in Bermuda because they had no interest in the Cats, and they effectively helped fund Team New Zealand. So they played the long game in terms of, we're going to back Team New Zealand for 2 cycles here because we feel that they will probably win the America's Cup at some point, and then we'll be challenger record, and then we can win it. And they've now played that hand and they haven't won it. So
the only thing that I think Luna Rossa will be slightly pleased of is that the Cup's not with Oracle. So I think that goal, and that was basically the uniting thing between Team New Zealand and Luna Rossa, was just a desire to kind of move it away from, I don't know, whatever they saw Oracle representing.
Well, Oracle effectively wanted the America's Cup to be what Sail GP is now. So is the America's Cup in its current format a better format than Sail GP? Because that's what it would have been. We've actually run the parallel scenarios. Yeah. It's very rare you get the chance to do that.
Okay, quick question. Are we going to see racing out here in the Solent for the America's Cup for AC37, Tom?
No.
No.
No, I don't think so, but we're going to know in about 80 days' time, I think, what the likelihood of the next Cup is. Well, I think also Team New Zealand have, probably to call it an ultimatum's a bit severe, but they have asked the New Zealand government to let them know within a given time frame what the funding situation is going to be around defending the next America's Cup in Auckland. So based on the result of that discussion, they'll look at other options for where they could potentially defend the America's Cup.
Personally, I really doubt it. I think, I don't think INEOS are in it to kind of like bring the Cup, and they're in it to win the Cup, but they're not here to bring the Cup artificially to the UK. Of all the teams, they're probably the least beholden to sponsors who want to see a Cup on local grounds. It's just INEOS, and I think INEOS are in it just to be involved in this kind of technological race and the kudos of competing in a technology race, like F1 is, like the investment in the 2-hour marathon, that kind of thing. It's that level. I don't think they gain much from bringing it here artificially. I would think they want to bring it here after winning it. So if anything, it's Emirates Team New Zealand who probably gain more in that they're more likely to need, you know, global sponsor backers, and maybe Europe is another outlet for that. So I don't see a real big pull towards the Solent immediately. So I kind of view it as maybe more of a either a bargaining chip, like you were kind of saying, rather than anything sincere. But you know, who knows? It's America's Cup, anything could happen.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing on this is Team New Zealand they effectively had a proposal out looking for bidders for the next cup to defend it. They've had that out for months. We've only heard rumours about cows. So it feels like there probably aren't that many takers for that offer, doesn't it? Otherwise, there'd at least be rumours around. And it's a bit surprising that there aren't any of the Gulf states have even been mentioned. Like, does the cup bring them enough? Would it even be a good place to sail a cup? Who knows? Yeah, it just feels like there would be rumours, wouldn't there, about somewhere.
Let's put that one to bed, and because it'll come out eventually, and we can speculate to the cows come home. And I don't think they know themselves yet. So I don't think we're going to add anything more to that. The format for the racing, so just specifically how the races were handled. We've talked about this a little bit before, but I'd like to kind of cover that off. Tom, what do you think about the stadium racing courses?
Stadium racing course, I think it's good to have some constraints. You don't really want boats just going out and banging a corner and coming in. The constraints, in theory, should have led to kept the racing a bit closer. I think we were a bit unfortunate with the wind strengths that didn't allow, because it was generally lighter, it was much more difficult to get through another boat's dirty air. So I think they maybe would have been a bit better with a slightly wider courses, but I think in general, I think the constraint is a good thing. I like the upwind starts. Actually, just a slightly longer start sequence, but with a smaller starting area would have really made that bit a bit more exciting. We're yet to really see if changing the course would have made much difference in the racing quality, if that had induced more overtakes. It's kind of difficult to say that.
It's kind of a fact of sailing though, isn't it? I mean, when you're involved in racing, a lot of the racing kind of feels exciting because, you know, you've got skin in the game. But the fact is, you know, very rarely do you have a regatta where every race is champagne conditions with lots of overtakes. And in fact, actually, being involved in championships dinghy racing, you actually often feel as a sailor the best races are the ones where the least happens and it's most consistent, but it doesn't make for the best TV. How did you feel about it, Rob? What's your take on the whole?
Well, I agree you need boundaries for the racing, and we saw something like 2,500 boats on the water watching, so and those are not all little kind of small pleasure craft with 5 people on them. So you've got 50,000 people watching this on the water. I wouldn't say that's over exaggerating it. So without the boundaries, you're just not going to get that. So they are a positive thing in terms of spectator access. I think if it's back in Auckland, they need to try and manipulate the timing so that the actual cup is sailed more in like January. We just saw the conditions get progressively less and less exciting as time went on, and obviously that was all set in stone a long time before COVID became a factor. And actually this time round, it was lucky that it was late. Otherwise, I don't think it would have happened.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, my personal opinion on it was, we need some sort of boundaries. How wide they should be is up for debate. It did hurt some of the racing in that you could see the boats were mismatched enough, but close enough that you would have got interesting racing if it was just a little bit longer, whereas it did kind of stifle the overtaking having the narrow courses. Normally a narrow courses keeps 2 boats that are disparative together and makes for better racing, but in this case we had a well-matched cup, and even like the semi-finals and the Prada Cup final as well could have maybe been a little bit more open. The course is a little bit wider, but that's condition specific, and as soon as it got shifty, it got interesting again. So you know, maybe we just got to accept that not every race is going to be, you know, top quality. That's what makes a good race is good, is if the, you know, you can't have all cherry and no cake, can you? So I think one thing we're all kind of unanimously agree on though is maybe a longer pre-start. Yeah, I get it doesn't make lots of sense to people who are completely new to sailing, but I don't think it takes that long to get it, and it is one of the most intriguing parts of the event. And I felt like we only really got kind of one set play by each boat in the pre-start. It was only long enough for that, whereas if it had been a little bit longer and was forced a few more permutations to come up, that would have been more interesting. The rules, these boats are so different to what we see, and it's no surprise that the rules weren't perfect, but there were some kind of really stupid and frustrating stuff. I've made some videos on it. My views are pretty clear on the boundary penalties was a big one. They made no sense. How do you feel about the boundaries penalties?
I think what you covered in your previous video was bang on. Yeah. That the amount that you were penalised didn't really make logical sense. Yeah. I think we covered it in that if you just deliberately sailed out the course and got foiling and then came back in, like, you'd take a huge penalty because of the gain that you would have had from going out and coming back in foiling, versus a jibe off the foils. And I think you mentioned it about you cannot go beyond.
Yeah, so I think maybe you could have a second boundary, that is, if you go past that, it's instant disqualification. I mean, I just think the penalties are just so arbitrary and pointless. It doesn't even make sense. Like sailing, if you infringed in the old days, you didn't even get to exonerate yourself. You were either proven innocent or guilty in a protest later, and you were either allowed to keep your result or you were disqualified. Then people thought that was a bit harsh, so we went to this idea of you can do penalty turns on the course, so you can exonerate yourself on the course. And now they've just gone to this arbitrary system where they say it's all done by a computer, but it's not, because the way it was enforced at this cup proved it wasn't. It was so inconsistent. And I actually think the best way in these boats for them to exonerate themselves is they effectively get a drive-through penalty. Everyone would understand that. It would actually make the racing quite exciting. And you'd do that by you just have a single windward mark and maybe a leeward mark, an additional 50 metres upwind and downwind. And then at some point in the race, the boat who's infringed has to take that penalty. I think for the non-sailing fan, that would make it more exciting. That distance could be set based on what the wind conditions were, and then at least there's a fit. Like if you infringe, like if we infringe, that's what we've got to do. There's no always, is attack going to be enough? Is a shift going to count?
There were two things with the penalty. I think first of all that it wasn't intrinsic to the boat who penalised. So the people on the boat, you had this frustrating communications loop with people asking whether they'd done their penalty or not on the boat to Richard Slater, and there's a back and forth, and by the time he said yes or no, they've done more or less, and the penalties ended up being wildly different depending on whether, you know, the umpire called it quick enough that they'd done their penalty. That was frustrating. I think the penalty should be something that people on board know they have done and completed, can put behind them and carry on racing. I also like it if it's something that's skillful for them to do, like they've got to do it in a way which works best for them and picking the timing of it. So that's why I like carrying the penalties through the race, because there's a certain sort of game theory behind when you take it, how you take it, and your boat handling when you do, which is interesting. So that was and I'm sure there's lots of different solutions to it. The drive-through are like just a VMG duck, you know, just to hit negative VMG for any amount of time, because that's something you can see on your boat, on your instruments. You're not waiting for someone else to tell you, and you can carry that and take it whenever. But yeah, kind of frustrating for me. And the other frustrating thing about the rules was this whole kind of predicting where the boats would be in a certain amount of time, but without factoring in deacceleration when you tack and jibe, so it made it almost impossible. And how fine the boundaries around the boats were, so that normally there's this whole thing like if there's a doubt of whether a port boat's going to cross and the starboard boat has to avoid them, then kind of like it errs on the side of the starboard boat. If they felt like they had to change course, then there's kind of like that air towards them. But with the accuracy of the computers, there's no doubt there, and you kind of left with this person who they can't see it on a GPS plot to 3 centimeters, and they've got to hold their nerve. Then it's a bizarre situation.
Well, I mean, I don't think we saw a single penalty given against the give-way boat, apart from when INEOS barged in at the starboard end, and that was a complete farce. So the one time that the give-way boat actually got penalised, it turned into a farce. And so I just think that says it all.
It needs refinement, that's for sure, that whole system.
Yeah, but to be fair to them, they didn't have the World Series, so maybe these things get resolved, and I hope they do get resolved for the next cup, because they deserve better, and there are alternatives out there to
and it's been pointed out to them now.
So we've covered INEOS and American Magic. Let's talk about Luna Rossa and Emirates Team New Zealand. Let's start with Luna Rossa, because I think they surprised a lot of people, and there were a lot of positives to the campaign. Ultimately came up short. What do you like about their boat from a technological point of view? What do you think they got right?
I have to say, I thought it was the best looking boat. I thought that their rig looked really nice, really well set up. Their sails looked fantastic most of the time. I think from a visual perspective, to me, it looked like the most refined package at the Cup. I think they really they committed to their design philosophy early on. They weren't particularly risky, but what they made a really nice, safe package. So I think that their foils, we know that they kind of went down a interchangeable route, so they could make small iterations to one foil over the other. That's really sensible. Like, you're going to end up with something that's ultimately good and should work and isn't very risky. But the problem with the America's Cup is that sometimes that approach isn't always the right way forward, and sometimes just being good or very good is not quite enough, and I think that's what we saw, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I remember saying to you after the round robins, I just feel like Luna Rossa are too safe. Everything just looked a bit easy for them. It was, manoeuvres were fine, everything was just fine, but they never seemed to have warp speed.
But I think fine's almost a bit. It was actually good.
It was good, but it just looked safe. It just looked like the boat was too easy to sail. And at that point, we didn't really know much about Team New Zealand, other than they had tiny foils, and we'd seen them almost unable to even start the boat at the World Series. So we knew that boat probably isn't easy to sail. If there's going to be a trade-off between ease of use and speed, we kind of know where both these teams sit on the spectrum. And I actually think, looking at the Luna Rossa boat, a lot of what they did is probably better than the Kiwis did. We've made a lot about the Kiwi extra 18 inches of mast and 3 metres of sail area down low. But actually, I'd be surprised if that's even better than the Luna Rossa setup from an aero point of view. Their setup was so clean. And I do think if you just put the Kiwi foils on the Luna Rossa boat, it would probably be faster. I think the biggest problem with the Luna Rossa boat is that they were another of these teams who relied on 3 people to sail the boat. So just the fact that they didn't have dedicated flight controllers or a controller meant that Jimmy and Bruni had so much on during a race. Just during the course of a race day, they had a lot to focus on.
Right, that kind of covers off Luna Rossa. My opinion of them was, I love the look of the boat, like Tom. I've said that many a time, and I agree with what Rob was saying. Safe is probably the word for it. I also felt like they had a lot of they did have some cool tech, like the boom underneath the deck, which was quite a cool innovation. But in terms of working out the rules and getting to the edge of those rules and getting their interpretations through and their edges. Didn't really kind of like score any big kind of rule wins. Obviously the long running saga about the backstays that they ultimately lost, and really I don't think it would have been that big of a win anyway. I think on the, considering they were involved with writing the rule, I don't think they really came out with much of a gain from that situation. So a bit of a question mark there. The rig, the sails, I love the look of. It's hard to quantify that, but I did think it was great. The foils, again, safe. I think they work really well. I think there's a lot about it which was like super nice about the foils, but I kind of wonder whether, they still had a set of foils to go when they saw Emirates Team New Zealand come out with, or the T-foils actually be faster, because actually they all saw Emirates Team New Zealand for a long time off with T-foils, so they could have reacted to that, but didn't. Then they got to the December Christmas Cup. You still felt like maybe if Rossa really wanted to take risks, that was the time to, they had a set of foils which were bankers and they could have gone back to and modified. Maybe there's an opportunity there for them to really kind of split and, try and find a trump card that it seemed like Emirates Team New Zealand, like maybe not everything was super nice, but they had these kind of like extra trump cards on it.
I guess they're just worried at that point that if they'd gone for an aggressive T-foil and it hadn't been quite as good as they thought, and they thought, okay, now our option is we've got to modify our second set within the 20% rule and get them as fast as we can, they might not have qualified for the cut match with an unknown T set. So
that goes back to the risk and reward. Do you guarantee going to America's Cup? Well, not guarantee, but do you give yourself the best chance of getting to the Cup, or do you give yourself the best chance of winning the Cup if you get there? I think that was a question they probably faced, and they probably went for, making sure we get to the Cup and refining what we've got. And
they shouldn't have had a Challenger Series if that was their attitude towards it. They did hold all the cards when it came to that. They could have just challenged, couldn't they?
Right, let's talk about Emirates Team New Zealand, because, this is the team we saw the least of, but a lot of talk was a lot of like elements about their boat which was quite different to everyone else's. T-foils, a lot more cant, especially, upwind, and a lot smaller foils than everyone else. They had the lowered rig, the mass ball stump. So there's so many features to look at and discuss, but it's, what I'd like to get is your opinion on what was kind of the key ingredient, and where do the sailors fit into that as well? Because probably, a lot of people would argue the best sailors as well on top of that. How do these things into play? What do you think? Where would you pin the?
I think first thing is I think they do have the best sailing team. You've got arguably the best duo in world sailing with Pete Burling and Blake. And then you've got Glenn Ashby thrown in the mixes.
Blair.
Duke.
That's like a
yeah.
mix, isn't it?
Sorry, yeah. Blair
Pete
Duke.
Blake.
And then you've got
good,
Glenn Ashby thrown in there as well, who's no slouch. But for me, I think the rig stuff was interesting, and they've gone around to make little gains, but you just can't really look around the foils. Like 15-20% less wetted surface area than Rossa. And when you're flying 100% of the time during a race, there was some risks with that for the lighter winds, but actually they proved that their foils were plenty big enough and they had plenty enough power and lift in them compared to the guys with the bigger foils. So for me, it's hard to look past that, anything other than that being their real trump card and what actually won them this cup.
Yeah, everything else falls into the noise factor, in my opinion. The only thing that was a clear advantage to New Zealand was smaller foils, faster foils. But I agree with Tom. I think they do have the best sailing team. And actually, if you look at guys like Pete and Blair, they're super young still. Well, maybe not for professional athletes, but for like people really young. But actually, when you look at the sailing range they've done now over their lives, they're far more versatile than someone like Ben Ainsley. I mean, they've got foiling boats, Olympic class, Volvo, America's Cup under their belt. I mean, like the experience those guys have is just absolutely vast. And they're sub 35. I mean, how old even are they? I mean, they might like 30.
30-ish, yeah.
And imagine what those guys are going to be like in 10 years' time. Imagine what they're going to be like when they're Spittle's age.
Yeah.
They're just going to become unstoppable forces in the America's Cup. And I can see why Team New Zealand have written a rule where they want a nationality clause in place, because
Yeah, lock them down.
I'm pretty sure Ben Ainsley is on like $4 million a year with INEOS. But if that's what he's getting paid by INEOS, then Pete could be going out, and he'd be on like $10 million a year. Him and Ashby as well. Like, those guys are just so key to the success of the team.
And they've all got an engineering thinking, or they've come from, well, especially Glen Ashby, A-clats. Like, they're not just your stock boat. It's all about thinking and developing.
For me, that's I think the key bit. It's not on the race course they were exceptional sailors. They're actually, they're exceptional sailors for the whole cycle, and they've got that kind of development background, able to feed into the design team, and not only feed in, but actually lead the design team. It's them going to design team saying, this is what we need, this is what we should be trying to achieve, this is the control I want on the mainsail, this is how I want this to be. And I think that's what they've got from the A-class and the Moths, and other teams maybe don't have that kind of like system thinking. So I think that was the real key things. I don't actually think there were many instances where you could say their sailing on the course was like leaps ahead of anyone in terms of like shifts and strategy. I think they were like, I mean, don't get me wrong, they were good, but there weren't many moments where they like got a good shift which won them a race. It was mostly just good boat handling and following a set procedure. In terms of the boat, I think I like the mast stump. I think if not being able to figure out how to get a boom was symptomatic of INEOS's problems, figuring out how to get a lowered mast stump was symptomatic of Emirates Team New Zealand's ingenuity. But in the same way, I don't think the boom was maybe the nail in the coffin for INEOS. I don't think it was probably a huge thing. And I don't think the mast step was a huge thing, but it kind of shows the thinking behind the two teams and the contrasting. They were able to exploit the rules, really get to the edge of the rule and make it work. And that's what I liked about it.
But that stems from the whole process and the way of thinking, doesn't it? That's a result of a hell of a lot of other stuff that's going on.
I do also think the sailing team, if you had started the America's Cup final match with the Luna Rossa team in the Kiwis boat, they'd have won 7-0. And actually, the sailing team really showed their worth on the Kiwi side in that they went 3-all. And they obviously went away, did their homework, and then they managed to turn that round. And the second half was an absolute crushing. And they made visible improvements in the way they sailed the boats and strategy at the starts, all of that stuff. So just their ability to be flexible and solve problems quickly and then move on is...
They proved that they were good.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think if Luna Rossa looked back on it, I think no one was all the talks about how fast Emirates Team New Zealand were going to be, and they were quick, but then in those early races you saw that Luna Rossa were actually competitive, maybe not quite as quick, but certainly competitive and could win races. And they were Luna Rossa's perfect conditions, and they didn't quite, in retrospect, leverage that as much as they should have. They really need to sail those races perfectly, but they didn't. They had a few starts which were mistimed, a few shifts that he missed, the dropping off the foils when they pretty much won a race. Those sort of stuff kind of lost it. And then when they got into the second half of it, Emirates Team New Zealand were only going to get better, and the opportunity was lost before they ever really realised it existed. I think that's probably the thing looking back. And I think a few people were quite harsh about Luna Rossa's sailing team and saying the mistakes they made later in the series, where there's a few split tack situations where they, Bruni got the call wrong on that gust of wind on a tricky course C, and he bounced Emirates Team New Zealand to the right side of the course. I'm quite forgiving of that because I think they're kind of like racing things. Sailing's not a sport where you can ever expect to get every decision right. And, on a tricky course like that, I kind of feel that that's part and parcel of it.
To me, though, this comes down to them sailing the boat with 3 people. I actually think if you've got, where having a pure tactician comes into it is if you've got someone who's tracking the breeze, is it going to get, are we right or left now? Where do we think this is going? Like it didn't feel to me like they had someone who was an absolute pure, what are the numbers? What's the trend?
And for all the talk of Sabello's increased role in that situation, when it came to the crunch, it was still the helms making decision. I think that was a bit of lip service to the whole problem that they had. But it's not easy to recreate. You said before about how Emirates Team New Zealand, you love the discussion on board. It's very fluid. You've got this back and forth, and contrasting that to INEOS, who are very regimented. And I agree with you. It's a great thing to have, but it's so hard to just make happen in it. Like, how do you create that? Like,
well, you do that by getting the guys all sailing their moths on a Thursday evening, all hacking around the course, coming in, talking about it. Just you only get that with a culture within your team of it's allowed to be creative, to voice your opinions. Like, you say what you like. There'll be no negative repercussions for coming up with say what you think might be stupid. It might be brilliant.
Just be wrong.
Yeah, and if you're wrong, be like, oh well, I was wrong. Yeah. I've learned something, cool. Whereas I just don't get the feeling that that happens in a team like INEOS. Like, I get the feeling like if you're wrong too many times, you're out the door.
I can see why INEOS have gone down the path they have, because I think sometimes that military communication style is good, and obviously there's a reason military they use that in combat, in that you can't have too many people talking a lot of the time, but then it's still a reasonably close-knit group of people on the 75. It's not a lot of voices to control, and you do think if you could they definitely got a lot of mutual respect on that boat, and I think that really worked for them. I do wonder how easy that is to recreate with different personalities on different teams.
Well, I just think actually, when you look at the INEOS guys, that whole team are pretty chilled out. Actually, I reckon it's like they're the naughty school children and they've got Headmaster Ben looking over them, and they're all like, we can't have too much fun here, otherwise we might get in trouble. And to me, that's a bit what it feels like. So either he's got to lighten up a bit. I mean, we don't know what he's like in the team. He might have a great sense of humour. He might be an absolute... The guys might all love him, but on the boat, it feels like he's the boss and you don't piss off the boss. And just little... I mean, we've really got off the subject of Team New Zealand, but it's just things like... It's things like when you have a video, like you have a media output from your team called Gov's Call. Yeah. Just little things like that, to me, it's just bollocks. It's like, it's all about this one guy. Like, you're just creating completely the wrong mindset in your team. Yeah,
I get that. Right, I think that brings us to a bit of a conclusion for Emirates Team New Zealand. I'm really looking forward to the next cup. I think it's going to be interesting. So I think we are seeing INEOS are definitely in it from the long haul. We had Jim come on board and the question marks whether he'll get bored of it like some billionaires do. I don't think that's the case at all. I think he's in it for the, I say right reasons, like he's in it he's in it because he appreciates the challenge, which I think is a big bonus. I think rather than wanting to just buy something that's got kudos, I think he's wanting to invest in the challenge, the process of learning and getting better and being seen as technologically advanced. So I think that's good because that kind of protects some of the values that I appreciate in the America's Cup. Question mark for Emirates Team New Zealand now is, can they resist that powerhouse of money and tech, and that INEOS are now going to put over several cycles, it seems, if they're keeping the AC75. That's the big question mark for the Team New Zealand dynasty, I guess, going forward, and that's what I'm looking forward to seeing in the next Cup. That's it for us on the America's Cup. We've got some big racing coming up this weekend where the Mozzy Sales panel go head-to-head in the Hailing Island. First pennant weekend, straight out of lockdown, straight into competition. No one sailed in 6 months, so it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting, so might get a bit of boat park walk around for that. But yeah, thanks for watching through the America's Cup. It's been hugely appreciated. A few people have messaged me asking how they could contribute or whatever to this thing we've been doing, and I'd say don't, because it's just been a load of fun. But if you do feel like you want to give something, then you can donate to the bots, bash, charity. I really think that's a great thing and would be fitting for the America's Cup as well. And that's it. Thank you guys for accompanying me through lockdown in the America's Cup.
Well, I've stopped recording, but they could just support us by maybe the hashtag like Mozzy sales for Sky Sports, say 37, something like that.
Yeah. Right. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.